So yeah, it's an evolving. I mean, this is critical national infrastructure. There's going to be evolving changes, and we've learned a lot in terms of our work with the different operators in the different regions and what needs to get done. Different policy implementations, similar underlying technology requirements. It's all part about staying humble and listening, is to learn that stuff. And I think that's one thing we're good at. And I think that's some of the feedback I've gotten from customers, that when we roll in the door, we're not there to tell it how to. We're here to fix you and move you to the cloud, right?
Yep.
We're here to bring the cloud to you, understand what you need to make it work, and work together with you. Now, does that mean we're going to 100% move to a non-cloud model? Doesn't make any sense. I'm not getting leverage then. But on the flip side, most of the time when we sit down and learn, we can come up with the best of breed approach between the two. And it's been very effective with the operators that we've done it with.
Hello and welcome to another Telecoms.com podcast. I'm delighted to say we've got a very special guest this week, which is Sean Hackle. Have I pronounced that right?
Yep.
From Microsoft. I think you're our first Microsoft person.
Oh, wow.
So welcome.
Awesome.
And we're going to get into, as little as maybe even 5, certainly 10 years ago, you might have wondered why does Telecoms.com podcast want to speak to someone from Microsoft? They're all about Windows and Office and all that sort of thing. Even notwithstanding your slightly abortive attempt to get into smartphones and the operating systems there, which I'm sure is not your problem. But, sometimes you roll a dice and sometimes you get snake eyes, isn't it?
Hey, at Microsoft, they have a policy of embracing the red, and
there we go.
That acquisition was one of those things we embraced.
Yeah. Funnily enough, it benefited Nokia, but there you go. But that's what we're really going to get into mainly with you. Why don't we start? I'm trying to be a little bit disciplined when it comes to the amount of bullshit we talk at the start. Although having said that,
you're just launching straight into it.
Well, I was going to.
I thought you were going to have a nod to your little outing with Huawei and other people earlier in the week, but no. You didn't go out with Huawei in the end, did you?
I
did.
Going to. I did, but what? Yeah. Oh, okay. So I can say sorry. All right. I take it back. I was not going to talk shit, and now Pierre's just said you got to talk. I mean, Ian's just said you got to talk some shit. Yeah. So shout out for just stuff I've been up to this week. Had a great dinner with Huawei. Took us out for a steak.
What was it?
Gaucho. Yeah. I had a ribeye. Although I've got to say, they go, we recommend medium rare, and I was like, all right, but that was rare. It was it was.
Should have had medium.
I should have had medium. Yeah,
right.
It's fine. I got stuck into it. Once I got right into the middle of it, I got a bit scared, if I'm honest.
We're still mooing, was it?
Do you know what I mean? But that was really cool.
Was it on Air Street near Piccadilly?
No, well, I asked them if we could meet up near Chancery Lane, because there was a thing that we were going to after where we had drinks with Liberty Global's extended PR crew. So it's people
quite late drinks from what I
they ended up, So it's people from Liberty Global, people from VMO2, people from Liberty Global's PR agency, who are the ones who led us astray late into the night. So nice one, you lot, if you're listening. And it was a Tuesday night. So Wednesday was a struggle, because it was just me and Andrew. You know what we're like. I mean, if you'd been there, you would have been out till the bitter end as well. So we went and had dinner early, and then wrapped up about 8:30, and then went straight to this other thing. A few of the other usual suspects like Ray from Telecom TV were there. And then they'd just taken over a bit of a pub, and that was all good. We had a little natter with everyone, and we got to the end of it. They're all just annoyingly young, like in their 20s. And they just went, anyone want some afters? And I was like, you know me too well. And then
you had some raw beef in your stomach.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
And then they went off and found some like little, late night sort of clubby sort of pull-in joint type of place, and we just sort of sat in a corner and had a natter. And then before we knew it, it was about like 12:30.
Right.
But yeah, eventually got home, and all the trains had stopped, so that was all. So eventually got home about 2, which is hard going for a Tuesday.
You managed to get a train?
No, I ended up having to get an Uber with me and Andrew.
Oh God.
Yeah.
So clearly, I have to up my game.
Yeah. Well, quite.
If they're taking you out for Brazilian steak and stuff, and all I brought was some cheap
Argentina.
Japanese beer purchased at Waitrose.
Well, while we're talking shit, Sean, why did you bring Japanese beer?
A little bit of a miscommunication at the department store, or whatever you call them. I told the girl I was looking for for Canadian beer, and she said, "Did I ask her if she had any?" And she pointed out Acai, which is
just very not
obvious.
Canadian.
Yeah, it was very. Yeah, it was not obvious to me where the Canadian connection was there, but when you don't have choices, you make do.
Do you think she just does that for everything? People just ask for whatever, unless it's Japanese.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure she was paying a lot of attention.
No, she's like, let's just grab some beer and shut the fuck up.
Basically,
yeah.
I feel like, and I did. So I mean, I guess that was very Canadian of me.
Yeah. So Canadians are sort of perhaps even exceed the Brits in terms of politeness, I gather.
I just said thank you and I paid.
Yeah. Thank you for being unhelpful.
You have some
Here's my
quality
money.
Canadian Japanese beer.
Well, cool. It all counts. So yeah, that's I think that's all I've been up to. I haven't been out the rest of the week, and you didn't come out at all, Ian, because you're feeling a bit dodged that day. So you're probably extra pleased, seeing as it went on late.
I've managed 1 o'clock in the morning.
But yeah, it was great hanging out with all of them. It's nice. It feels like a bit of a return to like 10, 20 years ago, where there was a bit more larking about in the evening with PRs.
Hopefully not on a Tuesday though.
Yeah, it's not ideal. A bit of feedback. Tuesday's not ideal. What were you doing like Thursday that you couldn't do it then? Anyway, so there. Now I'll stop talking shit. Is that all right? Is that enough shit?
That's good.
Actually, no. I've got one more. I'm going to ask Pierre to repeat it. We were chatting earlier about sort of drinking culture in respective countries. So Sean's from Canada, but you're living in the States, 20 years or so?
Yeah.
And Pierre, we came up with a little joke that they've got. I think Canadians referring to American beer that you've had, because you spend a lot of time in Canada.
Bud Light, yeah.
Oh, in reference to Bud Light. How's the joke go?
I think it's like having intercourse in a canoe.
So that they're saying that Bud Light is like having intercourse in a canoe.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Fucking close to water.
Excellent. So there we are. In case you're in any doubt, Sean, this is a very sweary podcast.
We're all good. That's one thing. Canadians swear a lot more than Americans. It took me a long time to figure that out. In the States.
That's an interesting thing, isn't it? So we've got, and I think the Brits swear a fair bit. I would say probably the Scots and the Irish. I know Irish aren't Brits. Scots and the Irish even more than the English, but we all don't mind a swear. And yet we've got England or Britain and Canada reputation of being polite. So the two seem to go hand in hand. We'll be polite unless we're swearing our asses off.
I think it is. People in the U.S. interpret it as aggression.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Canadians don't interpret it. They just
right.
sort of something
just
you throw
emphasis.
in the middle of a sentence instead of
And, yeah. Well, it's the same here then.
Yeah,
totally.
Yeah. And so it's not so casual. And so in the US, it means when someone's swearing, it means something quite different.
It means an escalation.
Yeah. Well.
Right. Okay. Sean, so you're from Microsoft, and unlike maybe a decade or two ago, you very much have a seat at the telecoms table. So why don't we just take it from the top? Why don't you tell us what your role is at Microsoft and why that means you're on the Telecoms.com podcast?
Yeah, no problem. So I joined Microsoft about 5 years ago. Prior to that, I spent almost 20 years at Verizon. I was the head of enterprise product for both wireless and wireline. And before that, I'd spent another 10 years in the industry at different carriers like Rogers and Telus and KPN. And
so you're a proper telco guy.
So yes, I have some background.
That's what it says on your LinkedIn, proper telco guy.
Proper telco guy. And so, what I was brought on board to do was help start something called Azure for Operators. And Azure for Operators, just code word for the use of Microsoft technology for the network itself. So if you think about it, traditionally, Microsoft partnered with the IT department to deliver productivity tools, often employee productivity tools, and infrastructure as a service and development tools. And then, they worked with the chief marketing officer, chief product officer to go to market, right? In particular, there's a couple of European carriers. There's some of our largest distributors of Teams licenses because there's a pretty natural pairing between, say, purchasing a phone or an internet subscription and the services that run across it. The last place or the last folk that we weren't talking to was really the chief network officer.
Right.
And so this is a customer-driven thing. So we had the chief network officer or the chief technologist were looking at sort of the productivity gains that people were getting from the development tools and the automation cloud native development, right? You've got 5G, which is a service-based architecture. They're looking at those technologies saying, hey, can I use some of the tools that I'm using and gaining productivity over on the IT side and the network side? So it was a pretty natural conversation to flow into. And from a product development perspective, we continue to find ways to innovate together. So we've got things like ACS, which is Azure Communication Services, which is essentially network APIs that we can work together on. We've expanded that program since then. And edge compute was obviously an early area of experimentation. So there was a natural customer pull in combination with changes in the underlying technology that really, I think, led us to this place.
That's a good point. Before you go any further, I was going to ask like the kind of timelines of when these conversations are happening, and they probably coincide with what you just alluded to, which is changes in the underlying technology.
Yeah.
What are there any particular changes, any particular technological developments that have made this match happen?
Yeah, so I think it got started with sort of the adoption of the SDN technology. So you got SD-WAN, SD-WAN, or S-WAN, whatever you want to call it.
People who don't know, that means software defined.
Software-defined wide area networking. You've got the evolution of that into SASE to I can't remember what that does.
I don't know what SASE is.
I just had to do a webinar on that the other day, and I had learnt it for the first time.
Yeah, anyways, it's
software as a service?
It's routing. No, it's routing plus security in a zero trust
I'm
architecture.
look it up now. I feel better that you can't remember what it stands for.
It's a Gartner term. I'm sure it's super important.
Look, I can see it. Can see it. I've looked up what is SASE in the past.
Secure Access Service.
You just beat me to it.
Thank you. All right. Awesome.
So you only do your young Jamie thing when I'm looking it up.
Only when there's an important guest.
Yeah.
And then you've got mobile edge compute, which then turned into multi-access edge compute, which just rolls off the tongue. So you've got sort of that. You've got this push towards software-defined networking infrastructure as a service, which is a pretty natural trend. Very popular in the data center, extended out to the edge. So that started things. Then you got the service-based architecture and 5G, and 5G itself started to incorporate a lot of cloud native concepts in it. So there was I think a fairly natural evolution of the marketplace towards that. In concert, you had folks moving to a disaggregated hardware model pretty aggressively, right? So you had a bunch of folks moving away from traditional sort of vertically integrated appliance models into these disaggregated hardware models. So the way, and that's not entirely dissimilar from the evolution of the enterprise compute environment. At one point during my life, I ran an IT outsourcing unit at Verizon, believe it or not, and I saw the transition away from servers and mainframes into virtualized and cloud-based technologies. And you kind of went from appliance-based models to in-house virtualization or DIY virtualization, and then into sort of cloud. And there was you got a 20% improvement for one hop, and you got a 10x improvement for the next hop. And I think networking sort of went through from the vertical appliance model and partially to the virtualization DIY model. And now I think you're seeing an evolution to full sort of PaaS level.
Give me 1 sec, and then Ian, by all means, ask you a question. I just want to take one step back again. You'll get the dynamic with talking to me and Ian at the same time as I try and reduce it to words of one syllable, whereas he can normally keep up with you in your multisyllabic language.
Well, no, I was going to do a bigger picture thing.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll say what I was going to say, and you can tell me whether that coincides with what you were going to say. Just that talk about virtualization and software defined this, that, and the other. It strikes me that the mega trend that's happened over the last couple of decades is this ability to turn more and more stuff that might previously have been a piece of hardware into effectively something that's defined and controlled by software. Is that?
That's 100% it, right? It's faster and cheaper to change code than it is to change hardware.
Yeah. No, I was going to go further back than that, and just it seems to me like it's what's happening with telcos and telecom generally is use the word intrusion, which almost sounds like it's an aggressive thing, but it's IT technologies coming into the world of telecom to some extent, using chips that were intended that can be used for all sorts of other purposes as well, and getting the economies of scale from them, using software platforms that can be used more broadly, and taking advantage of them to do telco and other things on it at the same time. That's kind of what it seems to me. I guess the question in a way for maybe it's not even for the operators so much, but for the guys that have played in that appliance world, and we all know who they are, is what does it mean for them in a way? Because there's always this sense maybe that, if it can be done more cheaply, and if it can be done with these economies of scale by taking advantage of these IT technologies, then maybe maybe it leaves them with less role to play in future, I guess. Yeah.
Or a different role.
or
I
a
mean,
different role?
that's just, here's the economics of it, right? If, Microsoft publishes this, and I'm happy to share it, which is for every dollar in sort of Microsoft platform spend, our services-led partners make about $7.63 in revenue. Our software-based provider partners make about $10.11 in revenue. So there is clearly a model by which people can put services on the cloud and make a lot of money. I don't believe that the current supplier set, there are moving towards disaggregated hardware and using third-party, components to build these platforms, are making that kind of return. So as my part of my job, I work very closely with the Ericssons and the Nokias and the Maveneirs of the world, the Junipers, the Ciscos, et cetera, to show them the platform and the benefits of it. I believe very strongly that by putting their world-class engineering talent and knowledge in the domain on top of a tool set that is invested in, supported by millions of deployments around the globe, with tons of investment from our side and some very bright engineers coming together, that the end product will be better for the customer, potentially cheaper, and easier for them to build and deploy and innovate on. Yeah. So in the end, I believe that this is the reason I came to Microsoft, is I actually believe very strongly that getting to a platform-based solution that is extensible and open and interoperable is going to bring that infusion of innovation and ability to differentiate and efficiency into the model that is lacking today and is hurting everyone across the spectrum, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't, it's not as healthy as it could be. And I really see the promise here.
Do you think they can be, because I suppose if you looked at it from an investor perspective and you looked at one of the companies you mentioned, like Ericsson and Nokia, it's obviously a tough time for them at the moment because the market sort of shrank a bit last year. I think the forecast
Especially in North America.
this year. Yeah, and then I guess
especially your old lot. You're not spending much money at the moment.
You go back to the era before, what's his name? They're now Boy Echo, and back in the sort of Hans Vestberg era, and they sort of expanded into media, and they were trying to do some stuff in the cloud and various other things. And now they tried to do an edge platform. They kind of gave up because they said they couldn't really compete against the hyperscalers. They have, we might talk about this a bit later, but the CNIS, which is their own kind of telco cloud platform, which people are sort of, where does that sit with things like Nexus? And there's now this talk about using general purpose processors rather than the kind of dedicated silicon they used to do. And it's very much a kind of, let's just do radios and let's just do the software on them. And I just wonder if, is there a future for them where they do grow again, even though they're doing less than they used to?
So you should always talk to Ericsson about the profitability of their units. But some of my observations are, and I'll tell you what I've expressed to Ericsson and Nokia. And, I meet with Monica Zenthron, and I was just actually in Sweden yesterday talking to some of her team and vice versa. I have a great relationship with Fran here and over at Nokia. I think they're very forward-leaning. Essentially, if I can figure out a way for them to deliver software at higher quality, faster, and more efficiently to their customer, I don't think they were making a fortune on their platform before. Their words to me, not mine, right?
Yep.
If we can find a more efficient delivery mechanism that's standardized, that delivers new functions and features more consistently, allows them to get to less customization and more standardization across their deployment, I think it helps highlight the value of the engineering service and the depth of IP that they have. So I think it's the best of both worlds. Plus, right now they're stuck in this model where the innovation has to come from within. And let's face it, Microsoft does a lot of cool things, but Microsoft partners do a ton more cool things, right? So listen, Microsoft, no phone company is ever going to be an expert in mobile healthcare, maybe one, right? Or, we love to talk about flying cars and robot surgery and remote factories. It's very cool. The thing is, so Microsoft does engage to stuff like that, but it's not Microsoft. There's not 1,000 people in Microsoft that got into robot surgery, but there's a ton of partners out there building solutions on Microsoft technology. I think for both the operators and for the equipment suppliers, moving away from sort of closed user group mentality that sort of pervades telecommunications, which, by the way, I was very guilty of that when I was at Verizon. I've just seen the Microsoft model, and it seems to work better. It's a healthier model. So I think now people preach that. The carriers and the equipment suppliers have to start seeing that coming true, and that's what we're really focused on right now, is finding a way to get a healthier ecosystem overall.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just think, we were talking about articles we'd written before we came on, and I did a piece called "The Managed Decline of Vodafone" this week, and it wasn't even really it sounds like it's an attack on Vodafone, but it could have applied to a lot of telcos in Europe, because the perception has been, they were at their peak really sort of 20 years ago when 3G licenses were being awarded, and they've progressively kind of looked to different models to try and deal with the financial problems that they've got, which has meant offloading towers and selling, exiting some markets. But I could see a world maybe where some of the stuff that they do in future is done, and I'm not saying this as a criticism, it might make more sense because I don't think networks themselves are going to disappear. They're just too important. But maybe it's a company like Microsoft that builds out the edge infrastructure. You've got NVIDIA chips in there, let's say, you're running some of your RAN on that. The telco is really not sort of looking after, it's not an owner of infrastructure at all. It's just running the services and looking after the customer relationship. But
but I mean, how is it bad for the telco industry to have cheaper
No, maybe it
infrastructure
isn't.
that's
Yeah.
easier to run, more integrated, and easier to differentiate on, right? To me, that's a big plus. Like you asked why Microsoft's in the telecom game, period, right? So here's the thesis behind, Microsoft's, when you see we communicate with principles all the time, right? Like when Brad Smith was on stage in Mobile World Congress talking about AI principles and AI democratization, he started with a list of principles. By the way, that's a Microsoft cultural thing that worked. I mean, it's real, right? It's not just marketing. Like when we started off sort of the Azure for Operators organization, the first thing we had to do is put together a set of principles for the leadership team to get the funding to move forward, explained how we were going to approach the market.
I'm a big fan of principles.
Right.
It's you see it all the time, not necessarily in the context you're talking about, but just like in politics or philosophy or personal conduct. If you don't have certain foundations on which you build, then you're just floating around and you're just being opportunistic and being buffeted by fate.
So if you think about it, there's twofold. There's two reasons primarily we're there, right? First of all, from a customer perspective, the intersection between the hyperscaler cloud and the mobile network, or the network in general, defines how simple, how secure, and how resilient that cloud experience is. So there's a natural need to partner closer, right, with the operators, just for the cloud resiliency. And by the way, Microsoft has experience with this, right? We at one point let our sort of our global WAN lapse relative to our competitors, and it started to affect core cloud sales. So we spent a bunch of money to build out one of the largest backbones on the planet. So similarly, right, as more people move to mobile, this notion that we could fall behind from a technology perspective in the interaction with the operators is unsustainable. And so from that side, there's sort of the defense. And on the positive side, it gives us we believe strongly in sort of this whole, this what we call modern connected applications layer, which is essentially a highly distributed fabric, 5G through space, that interconnects compute, storage, and networking and makes it available where you need it, when you need it. So you're able to capture data, manage it, move it around based on what makes sense for the application. So, one, we saw the promise of where, this ubiquitous compute promise could go. And two, our partnership with the operators is very synergistic in terms of how it takes place with the customer. So you can see why it made sense for us to come in. And then when we decompose that into platforms or into principles, it really became, we are fundamentally a platform company, right? So we are looking to put people on the Microsoft platform.
Yep.
We do want to meet our customers where they are. So we're not migrating you to the cloud. We actually should think about it. We have a hybrid cloud model, which means you can bring in the cloud to you. So that's essentially what that means in very simple terms is, you need to put compute, networking, and storage at certain locations in the network, right? The VDU is always going to be 20 clicks away from the antenna, right? Yeah. The near edge is going to be governed by how your fiber architecture sits, which is governed by the regulatory and the geographic structure of your country. The enterprise edge, there's certain things that will only occur at the enterprise edge. We're going to put compute, networking, storage, but it doesn't mean you can't stretch the cloud over top of that, right? We manage a collective cloud globally right now in 65 plus regions around the globe. There's no reason you can't extend those same APIs over that infrastructure and standardize the management interaction.
How does that work in practice? So you actually sort of take your technology stack and would put it inside a telco's own sort of facilities, like a central office or something. That's kind of how that's kind of how the hybrid bit of it works.
Absolutely. So you just put generic compute, networking, storage, so standard stack of stuff, gear from Dell, from Arista, from Pure Storage, and we plunk it down in the telco facilities where it makes sense to manage that from, and then essentially you've got, we stick an Azure Linux layer, an Azure Kubernetes layer, what we call the telco grade cloud component, which is essentially a set of APIs that we know based on experience, capabilities we know based on experience need to be there to manage telco grade NFVI stack. And then we use Arc, which is sort of our common cloud management team, to extend the API. So you would use Azure Security Key Vault Management for managing security. You use Azure Observability, which is the Service Manager capabilities. You use ADO, Azure DevOps, to manage the code stream, and then obviously interfaces to AI and automation, right?
Yeah.
Are all there. And so essentially, you stretch the cloud over top of that infrastructure. So you're reusing where we put millions and billions of dollars of investment, right? This isn't a question of whose engineers are smarter. It's pretty straightforward. If I've got 1,000 people working on it versus somebody who's got 3 people working on it, in all likelihood, I'm going to have a more robust, resilient answer. That's just a math equation. And that's kind of what we've done. We've maximized the use of where we put our investments in the cloud, delivered them physically where they need to be in the network side, and then allowed people to build on top of that, which I think is a very, very efficient way of deploying that software. And
the alternative for a telco would be just to sort of invest in its own servers and tools that would go into those facilities. That's a traditional way.
Yeah, your option is to take a series. Again, we call it DIY virtualization, right? People did that in the day of, before in the data center too, where they built their own virtualization platforms. And it's a completely valid answer. The challenge you've got there, again, you have to maintain it. Right. In other words, whatever you design on day one, which is state of the art, will become state of the industry by the time it's deployed, and it'll be out of date 6 months in. So the question is, you're going to keep plowing dollars into upgrading that, especially in an age where things are changing very rapidly. Like look at the advancements in AI, right? No one practically could have seen that coming. Our customers get that as part of it's just a software delivery. That investment. You are responsible for the integration of that platform, right? In other words, you've got to keep those components going, and you've got to certify it with the vendor software. That's where the Ericssons in the world have said. I've seen Monica say it during the Ericsson Investor Day. It's very difficult for them to maintain and keep up with all of those variations in software. So you get challenged at delivering new functionality, new services with that. So I think we can simplify a lot of that using standard capabilities. And meanwhile, there's challenges in telecommunications in terms of security and regulation and governance that have been solved in financial services and healthcare, or stuff like it have been solved there. Why not get that innovation over? Why rely on a small pool of experts that understand sort of technology that applies to one industry and 700 carriers versus technology that's supported by millions of organizations, and you can draw on a broader, cheaper pool of both innovation and people to maintain and manage that. So it's just a more efficient way of delivering that service.
Can I address your rhetorical question?
Yeah.
Because I like doing that. I like it when people ask rhetorical questions and I answer them as if they're not. So you've made a very good case. There's play to your strengths and lean on partners for stuff that isn't your core competency. Mm-hmm. That's a lot of what I took from what you said. I'm sure I'm massively oversimplifying it, but as I said earlier, I like to distill things down to words of one syllable, and that's impossible to argue with. But the biggest argument in favour of what we could call redundancy. So you were sort of making an argument against redundancy. Don't duplicate the effort that we've already done and that we're likely to be better at than you. Why duplicate it? It's just a waste of time and effort. But the argument in favour of redundancy, more broadly, the argument in favour of redundancy is sort of security of sort of quality of service. If one, the reason you have 2 parallel chains going is if one chain breaks, then you've got the other one to fall back on. Mm-hmm. And then the other one, which is something that Ian and I talk a lot about in this pod, when we're talking about public cloud and we're talking about the hyperscalers. So, let's name them. When we're talking about hyperscalers and public cloud, we're basically talking about you guys, Amazon via AWS and Google via Google Cloud. That's just 3 players who also, and we'll probably get into this in a bit, who also have interests in all sorts of other areas. And so that's the other reason to perhaps build in a degree of redundancy is not just the fail-safe side of it, but the overexposure to one partner, however benign and lovely they are. So those are my 2 sort of pushbacks to your rhetorical question.
Well, since we want to get into it, that's good. How many choices are they working on today? How many choices they've selected from today in typical, especially in the European market? Isn't it maybe 2 operators, two choices primarily?
You're talking about vendors,
yeah,
like Nokia and Ericsson,
yeah.
Right.
So today you're locked into a vertically integrated stack provided by one of 2 vendors, 3 depending on your regulation in the country,
depending on who's allowed.
Right. So one, the notion that sort of the alternative is this wide open playing field is just not the case.
Yeah.
And two, two, again, we're talking about doing it at layers, right? So I absolutely think it makes sense to select layer and then have software choice. Like you take, say, for instance, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Coherent Networks, which is some really, really cool
I know
stuff that
really
Ray Dolan's a friend of mine. He's ex-Verizon guy. So,
yeah.
and I don't think his stuff runs on Azure
He's the
yet.
person
But
to tell me about Janus.
yeah. But we're working close with Ray and his team. His software, people will struggle to implement because it's not part of the existing ecosystem yet. I know he's got a lot of interest, so that could be not true a day from now. But because
his
this
main
stuff
problem
is so
seems to
good.
be opposition of Ericsson and Nokia potentially to doing it.
I don't know. I think anyways. Ray's stuff is so genius. I can't imagine it's not going to take off. But
that's interesting you say that.
You got guys like Ray, and there's 10 other folks that I've talked in I live in Silicon Valley. So there's 10 other people that got genius ideas out there, but they are going to struggle to get them in. My notion is if you've got an open interoperable software ecosystem on top of a standardized platform that's you can get, you can bring ideas in from multiple industries. You have a lot better choice there and a lot better redundancy. I just don't see the argument for doing, and there's nothing about subscale deployments that leads to things being more secure. Right. The short answer is security is a constant game of keeping up to date. And the notion that a small group, like when I was at Verizon, there was a limited pool of folks, very smart, by the way, some of the best people I've ever worked with, that understood security. But just in terms of sheer order of magnitude of resources, it's tough to keep up. And so you've got a few players in that space that have the resources to do that. You have the option of working with our partners like Palo Alto and Juniper and others that provide security services, as well as to bring in the Microsoft. Microsoft processes something like 65 trillion signals a day for its threat intelligence. Like, why wouldn't you leverage that? And so, my belief is fundamentally, so we're bringing in some of those zero trust based security practices, bringing, particular zero trust segmentation on top of strong identity, and embedding that into the telco infrastructure has nothing but upside. And if you want redundancy, listen, we are very cognizant that it's a multi-cloud world, and I fully expect every operator on the planet will continue to work with multiple clouds. Now, obviously, I think ours is a pretty strong offer and one of the better choices they could make, but let's face it, they do have choice. And then if we can bring more software providers to the table, including the traditional providers, again, Ericsson's got tons of engineering experience here. Yeah. Nokia's got some phenomenal software. Still want to make sure that's available. So I think they get the best of both worlds. I don't think they're making hard choices.
Yeah, I know, but I suppose to Scott's point, if you've got these three big platforms doing the cloud that are so critical in other areas like AI and not to mention all the kind of service innovation and stuff they do in the consumer world as well. The word's been used before, I think, in reports that have been written on this by regulators, that sort of systemic risk, because if something goes wrong with one of them, then I know the point you make about Ericsson and Nokia, but there's a huge concern among the operators, which is the reason we have this thing called Open RAN.
Yeah.
And there does seem to be some concern about being able to do things like move between hyperscalers easily or certainly have alternatives to them.
And I think what's interesting about Microsoft, listen, there is obviously Microsoft has a history in that space, and they've done a lot of things. That experience changed Microsoft. If you talk about the cultural change that was undergone at Microsoft's level, right? It's kind of interesting. I was showing a picture the other day of sort of Satya's third day on the job. So there was Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Satya. Satya's day 3. That's 2014. That was the day. And there's one of the things that Satya did, which makes him pretty amazing. And I know I sound like a fanboy here, but I actually will tell you he is as cool as everyone says he is. Not just in him personally, but the way he affects the organization. And you talk about the cultural changes that Microsoft underwent. We went from a culture of folks that were purely driven by the need to make dollars to a mission-driven organization, using our technology to make things, to change the lives and experiences people around the globe for the better. Truly believe that. You can see with what Brad Smith released with his principles of sort of AI and the AI economy at Mobile World Congress, where we're inviting people in, recognizing that people are concerned about the impact of AI and the need for people, for everyone to participate in the economic value that's created by it. You see, we went from a culture, this is a big thing because this used to drive me crazy when I was in the Verizon side with the Microsoft. We went from a culture of know-it-alls to learn-it-alls. And listen, when we approach the carriers, I'll tell you the same.
Epistemic humility.
Yeah. you want to learn. It's a learning culture.
I like that phrase.
Yeah, and
Right?
he always uses that phrase.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm with you. And that's a big, honestly, one of the coolest things about coming over was some of those changes. It just makes it fun to work there. And when we approach the carriers, it's the same thing. I'm not coming to the table, and I think we're a little bit unique in this respect, saying I got all the answers. Hey, we're going to outsource your network. Like everybody assumed when we did the AT&T announcement, we outsourced their network. We didn't outsource their network, right? I provide a platform they run their network on. If you want to know who sets their QCI policy, you want to know who makes determination of policies, it's AT&T people. They've been running that network for years. They're world class at it. I'm not better than them at that. They're not handing it over to me. I provide the infrastructure that they then build services on top and differentiate the experience for their users and decide how their business is going to run. You run SAP on Microsoft, doesn't mean I set your travel policy. You run your network on our hybrid cloud, doesn't mean I tell you how to run your network.
Yeah.
Right? That would be raw arrogance. And when we work with the operators, it's a great opportunity for us to learn from them. Our partnership with with AT&T has made us stronger and better. We've learned from their operations team about what we obviously acquired, affirmed, and Metaswitch to bring in people that understood what telco grade cloud meant at a deep technical level, and we have those folks beating the heck out of the platform to make it stronger. Remember, everything I build into the platform, if you don't, we don't bundle anything. If you buy Ericsson running on Nexus, you get the same features and functions and capabilities that you get if you run our AO5GC product, on that platform. That's just a fundamental rule of being a platform, right? First party access, third party access equals the same. So we keep that there. But we've got all of that. But then we work with AT&T and their AT&T operations practice, make the platform stronger. We work with the T-Slot, their security practices made the platform stronger. The things that the T-Slot security team asked us to look into and change in the platform are things that made us more capable of responding to UK TSA. So we've learned from that experience. You may have seen an announcement we did at Mobile World Congress with British Telecom, where we're trialing a AI-based service in the network. You mentioned sort of the impact of AI. This is a chance where we could take sort of some fundamental capabilities that come out of the telecommunications provider, the voice network, combine it with AI, and turn it into a service that made it safer for grandma, right? Like, essentially what we could detect is people trying to rip off grandma.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a clear, again, it's a clear
That actually happened to my dad a couple of
Yeah.
years ago. Someone pretended to be from Virgin Media,
Yeah.
and he was so naive that he gave them remote access to his desktop.
Yeah. And to be honest, as we're doing this, the number of people who get worked up about this project is huge because so many people have encountered this. I get enraged when I think of somebody trying to rip off my dad. Like,
Yeah, do you know?
right?
Yeah.
Like just enraged. And so the chance that we can do stuff like that together. And by the way, that idea came out of some brainstorming between us and BT. We started down one set of paths where we thought we knew some answers for them. After we kicked the ideas around, we came together on that, and that's something we're now trialing. Right now, there's still a lot of things to resolve before you take
go
the
ahead,
full
mate,
market.
because I've got a tangent. So
I was
say your bit.
just going to ask. I mean, do you think the message is kind of getting through to operators? Because you've got the big deal with AT&T, and the one with Etisalat was very recent. I remember covering it in the run up to Mobile World Congress. But Scott and I meet the European operators a lot, obviously, because we're sort of in Europe, and the BTs, the DTs, the Oranges of this world seem to be very concerned about. They seem to be very happy to work with Microsoft on the IT side of things. And there was a big announcement with Vodafone, I think, obviously, a few weeks ago. When it comes to their kind of core network and the RAN and this sort of stuff, I think Microsoft has this expression, and you might have used it already, the DIY cloud, but they seem to be quite committed to this DIY approach. So BT has this thing it's doing with Canonical. I think Deutsche Telekom has a similar thing called TCAS. Orange has been pushing this silver concept, which seems to be, I'm just kind of curious what.
To give you, again, right, they've all got legitimate efforts going and they're all relevant. We just launched our IMS product on top of NIMS, which is the Deutsche Telekom platform. So very familiar with what they're doing there. It's fantastic. We had a great, super effective for their business. A lot of impact there. Claudia Nima knows what she's doing. That whole team over there are solid quality engineers. We work with them, meet with them frequently. We agree with their notion that leaders in the market should work together, and we enjoy working with them. And so we'll still have that conversation if what we can do is accretive to their business. BT, the guy who built the BT cloud is Reza, who's the gentleman that we announced with the work on the AI last week. So we work. I meet with Reza quite frequently. I've been in Europe the last 3 weeks in a row. I've been in many of the countries. I don't remember them all. I'm a little bit brain dead right now because I've been traveling so much, but I've been in a lot of them. I've had a lot of different, and then now here I am in the UK. I think, we meet with Laurent and the team at Orange fairly frequently. Like, yeah, we get it. There's some, we one of the other principles, I mentioned the principles, right? So the principles, we're a platform company. Another ones, we work with the ecosystem, right? So we're, you know, if I came along and said you got to replace all your OSS and BSS work and you get rid of Nokia and Ericsson, you might not talk to me right away, right? Doesn't make sense. It's impractical. Awesome for greenfield networks. There's like 3 of those, right? Most people are brownfield. We need to have a practical solution there. But the last principle on the list is it's a journey, and we'll work with you. The last principle on the list is this is a journey. So again, we worked very closely with AT&T for an extended period of time to get aligned on the vision and the business case and what made sense for their business before we executed on that project. I was personally involved in that. Yeah. And you can see what shamelessly, Agal now describes the results he got as remarkable. Love that one because he's hard to please. We're working closely at Reza now. We've got obviously Khalid Mershad at Etisalat, which, Etisalat is a very innovative, like if you want to see where some of the possibilities in the industry might be, is if you look at the innovation in Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia, there's some super interesting things happening in those companies, and they're very forward leaning. So we're excited to work with them. I think you'll see more carriers making the decision to work with us. 3 UK, for example, is an early adopter of our Azure Operator Insights, which is essentially the use of cloud technology to do networking analytics and network analysis. Right. On the Vodafone side, obviously, we started with a pretty, there's an evolution in that relationship, right? We started with a pretty traditional data center effort, right, where we're helping them standardize in their infrastructure and migrate to the cloud. Again, we have the go-to-market effort because we have a lot of synergistic efforts there. They're using AI Copilot to extend their the value of their
you talk about Vodafone.
Yeah,
I actually sat next to Scott Petty, who I presume you've encountered.
Yeah.
And at a thing that we've spoken about on the pod, it was a couple of months ago, I think. Mm-hmm. And he just went, do you ever use Copilot? Just straight up. I mean, it was in the context of talking about AI, so it wasn't just idle chit chat. But he says he finds it useful for all kinds of things, like just transcribing meetings and all that sort of stuff. And I find that very interesting to see where AI, we're if you listen to the pod a lot, you know that I've got a hair trigger when it comes to being sort of dystopian and apocalyptic about AI. But then when you just look at little incremental useful things like that, like let's say, for example, if we had an AI that transcribed this whole podcast and we just published it and we got some cheap and easy traffic from the written version, what's not to like? Yeah. It's just a hell of a lot of labor saving. So that I don't get dystopian about, far from it, because I'm a big fan of saving my labor.
Yeah. If not to sound too much like a commercial, but if you want to tell me practically where we're seeing it work right now. So if you think about sort of the average customer service rep or the average network operations, the NOC person, if you look at sort of the 25 minutes they spend on a call, right? You spend about 2 minutes actually fixing the problem, which is where they really add value. These are smart people. They make the changes. They spend 5 or 6 minutes looking across 5 or 8 different systems trying to figure out what's going on. They spend another 15 minutes, 20 minutes surfing websites and internal websites, external websites, vendor sites, policy sites to figure out what to do. And then they do the 2 minutes worth of actual change, which is the 2 minutes that matter in the action of the customer. And then they spend 5 minutes documenting what happened afterwards.
That gets automated.
Right? If you think about that, right, that 2 minutes is not getting automated. Right, that 2 minutes of the actual fix, but the time it spends to look up all those different things, the time to cross-reference into all of these documentations, and the time it takes to write and summarize what you did for future reference, all of that can be simplified down. Now, you still have a person making a decision ultimately. And that's why it's called Copilot, not autopilot.
Yes.
Is which I think is super important.
Good choice of name.
You got to leave agency in the model, right? It's all about leaving agency, but you can give people better information to make decisions. You don't have, like, nobody's having a better day because they had to surf through 9 websites. Like, there's no,
Indeed.
I can't conceivable, maybe there's one person, but I can't conceive of someone who gets moral satisfaction out of hunting.
Although lots of people,
through.
I mean, this is again quite a hackneyed and cliched take on AI and automation, which is the amount of jobs it makes redundant. Mm-hmm. And one thing I appreciate, like for example, when I'm talking to my mates about a point of current affairs, it's just so hardwired into my MO because of my job to just be able to research something moderately comprehensively in a very compressed period of time. Mm-hmm. that I always feel I've got that advantage over my mates in terms of, we're speculating about this, and within 5 minutes I'll have 10 Google windows up with different reports on it. And so the reason I'm saying that isn't just to self-aggrandize, is to say that I have this skill that to some extent could be made redundant by AI, which perhaps contributes to my market value, which is that I'm above average at quickly researching topics on the internet because of my day job. So that's where I can see people get a little bit twitchy. But then again, that's quite Luddite. And just because it makes repetitive jobs redundant doesn't mean it's bad. Of course, in many ways, as you just articulated, it's good. But you can see why some people get a bit worried about that sort of thing.
Change is awesome when it's not happening to you, right? Like,
Yeah.
when I'm the benefit of it, when I'm the beneficiary,
then
it's awesome. But when it's
all
happening
good.
to me, it's pretty threatening. And I think we recognize that, right? So I think people recognize that you've got to walk people through the process. We talk about the ethical use of AI, and we have principles there that we talk about. But people mean that. I mean, they're serious about this stuff. And so, yeah, absolutely. We have to be, and people talk about, I sound like a Harvard Business Review argument, but you have to be human in the way that you interact with your employees and your customers, and understanding their fears about that and listening to it, right? It's easy as a technologist that's back to the learn it all versus know it all culture. Like the know it all culture says, we just put these guardrails in the engine and it's all taken care of. So just shut up and don't worry about it. That's not, nobody walks away from that conversation happy. I might feel better because I sound smart, but the person on the other end doesn't feel listened to or acknowledged. And by the way, you might learn something. Like if you listen to what they're concerned about, there may well be something in that concern you hadn't thought through. And so there's just the notion of listening
and it might
and understanding
inform your other stuff.
Right. And so you get better if you sit and you learn and you listen first. And again, it sounds cliche, but just exercising that discipline, that mindset that I'm going into the conversation to learn is a big important part of that.
What you're saying there reminds me. Sorry, did you have another thing?
No, I was going to ask about the the guys that you are talking to in Europe who are doing this sort of DIY cloud approach. I mean, they've sort of set out their reasons for doing it a lot of the time, which seems to be this desire to kind of keep control and be involved at that level. But what do you say to them in terms of, I mean, presumably the Etisalat will already have seen some of this because it would have moved, like, I'm guessing, from some kind of on-premises thing that it was doing
they
itself
have
before
a number of options
to doing it with you. But what do you say in terms of this is what it's going to do for you if you go to Nexus rather than DIY?
Yeah. So really so a couple things that they and I actually have to educate. They instantly get it. They want to know more how and can it be cost effective, right? So they understand the value of going to true cloud native. When I say that means they're already using those tool sets and those capabilities like Azure DevOps. Lifecycle management is a huge problem in telecom, right? People are very frustrated by it. And so the ability to implement changes quickly and with high quality and with resilient testing, everybody wants that, right? Because it builds a more resilient, more secure network, which you have to have if you want to keep your job, right? Yeah. And so people get that already. I don't have to sell people on the value of AI, right? People get it. They want to understand where the real use case is and what can really get done. That's why I gave you the case I gave earlier, because that's pretty much a pattern that works really well with NOC and with customer service agents. There will be more, but that's one. That's an area where I know instantly it works pretty well. So that notion they get right away. I think most people are starting to realize that zero trust security architectures truly, right? In other words, having a moat and castle where you're protected when you've got all the software and these services out there and you're interacting with the outside world, whether it be customers or partners more often, you have no choice but to implement that. So they're seeing value in using that. And they're selling to their customers too, right? They're selling SASE and ZTA to customers. So they know what's out there. So they get it. Now it's a question of saying, okay, practically how do I get my organization to head that way? Are my vendors going to come with me? In other words, are the traditional vendors going to support me? Am I doing something where I'm going to be on a ledge by myself? And then what's the business case? How do I practically square in the end, nobody's getting bigger budgets, right? So what's the very practical implication of how I get there? What's the migration path and what makes the most sense to me? And that's where I spend most of the time with these folks going through that. So I think
the vendor one seems like a given though, surely, because it's harder for a vendor to do something for BT's own homegrown cloud, I would think, than to do something. I mean, you were saying you were working with Nokia quite a lot on the vRAN side, and
we did the announcement with them at STC last month, where we had their Open RAN platform running on Nexus, which was obviously pretty exciting. And
whereas if they have to worry about putting it on BT's telco cloud done with Canonical, then it would sound like more of a a kind of
It's more one-off. It's more one-off.
yeah, bespoke or whatever. Yeah.
But that's why, and you also see they obviously have their own in-house platforms. That's low risk for them, right? So it's tested, done once. They've got the deployment scripts done that way. So obviously, they've got some predisposition towards that. But yeah, I do think actually the move. And they listen. I don't think I'm talking out of turn. As you talk to Monica at the investor day, or talk to Fran, I think Fran already did the announcement with Red Hat, right? And so the announcement there, he also said, and you can use the cloud of your choice in doing this, right? He was very clear that he would support that. So obviously the Nokia gets it, and I think Ericsson gets it. It's just a matter of timing, right? They've got X number of engineers. They've all won lots of business. They've got to get it done, right? They got to fill the book that they've got today, and then they can invest in the platforms as we go.
So could you see them doing a similar thing to what Nokia's done and sort of ditching CNIS ultimately?
So you have to ask Monica that one. I know what I hope. I know what I'd like them to do, but
because that platform still. So this is an interesting thing about these applications being sort of tied to the platforms that were done by the application developer. In the case of the vRAN stuff that's being provided to AT&T, and you'll know all about this obviously because it's the company you're involved with. But when I've spoken to AT&T, they've said, well, we're sort of doing some applications on Nexus, but some of them are on CNIS on the RAN side. Yeah. Which doesn't sound ideal. You'd obviously want to have this single horizontal platform approach from a.
But they're torn by some practicalities, right? There's AT&T is a very large network, and they've and they're in stage one, or the initial stages of what their decision making process are, and they've gone some certain routes, and we'll see how that evolves.
Yeah.
But
so I'm gonna finally go. I've been brewing a few tangents in my mind while we've been talking.
Right.
The biggest one is to do with what you were talking about, making kind of analogy between how the telecoms market's evolving and how Microsoft has historically. And I just dialed up Microsoft's share price on Google Finance, ironically, not Edge.
Ouch.
Ouch. Meow. And basically, for about 10 years between when the dot-com bubble burst and about 2011, you didn't gain anything on Microsoft shares. You bought your shares and they did fuck all for a decade.
Yeah.
And then you get to around, and that coincides with the time. And I'm not trying to make this personal, but a lot of this coincides with the time where Steve Ballmer was in charge, and he made some missteps, including like buying the handset division off Nokia. And within that, this was my core area at the time. What I found fascinating more than buying the handset division was the attempt to make Microsoft, I think it was Windows Mobile, and then it got rebranded to Windows Phone when they made it a bit more of a touchscreen specific thing. Because I remember my first ever smartphone was called an HTC Titan 2. And I think it had a slide-out QWERTY hard keyboard, and it used Windows Mobile that was still using Windows-style drop-down menus. So you had to have a stylus. So it's basically a tiny little compressed version of the desktop one, which obviously was not at all mobile device friendly. And then, of course, you got iOS and Android coming out, and suddenly everyone, and they weren't the only ones to get burnt, like Nokia itself. One of the reasons Nokia felt compelled to sell all its mobile assets to Microsoft is they'd gone all in on Symbian, and that was similarly nowhere near as touchscreen and handset friendly as iOS and Android. And so that was a time with Ballmer. I don't necessarily blame him, but what I think he was typical of, which is where, I told you it's a tangent, but I'm bringing it back slightly to what's relevant to what we're talking about.
Actually, your show.
It's my prerogative. Is his period seemed to be symptomatic of Microsoft having to evolve. There was a cliche in the 80s and 90s, perhaps more 90s, where a business cliche where they said we're moving from being a box shifter to being a solution provider. I don't know if you remember that cliche.
Yeah.
And perhaps Microsoft was most typical of that because it was a box shifter. It was selling, perhaps not always literally in a box, but it was selling boxed versions, certainly of Office a lot of the time, as something that you got on a CD or whatever, and you downloaded it locally. And to some extent, you could even say that was true of Windows, although, of course, it always came bundled in PCs. And I think that's the Ballmer period. I think he was still trying to sell software licenses with Windows Mobile. He was trying to go, look, people pay us per license of Windows, people pay us per license of Office. I want OEMs to pay us per license of Windows Mobile, which might have worked if there weren't two platforms out there already. One which was proprietary for Apple, and one which was Android, which was free to vendors. Of course, we know with everything to do with Google, if it's free to you, then you're the product. But nonetheless, there was no way Microsoft could have expected people to pay a software license for its arguably inferior product when they could get one that was at least as good for free. That was the reason, the main reason in my view, why Windows Mobile and Windows Phone failed. So Barmer was sort of overseeing that, and he eventually sort of threw in the towel and went, "Yeah, all right, I'm just going to retire on my shares and yachts and whatever it is that he's doing now." And as you say, Satya Nadella, is that how you pronounce his name? Took over, and his, my understanding, you'll know a lot more, but his tenure was sort of defined by repositioning Microsoft as a cloud company rather than a software company. And so what you're describing is completely consistent with that. And then you look at Microsoft's share price. Can you remember off the top of your head? I think you just said it earlier when Nadella, you talked about him hanging out with Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer.
Yeah, I think 2014.
2014. Was that when he became CEO?
Yeah, you could probably Bing that and double check me.
I can Bing that. I like it. Yeah. Sure, I'll Bing that. But let's go from the start of 2014. Microsoft's share price is about 38 to $40, and then by 10 years later, by 2021, it's nearly $300. Yeah. So you've got about 8 times your investment there, and then it dipped a bit after people realized they got a bit carried away during the lockdowns and all that. But now it's up to its all-time high of $428, whereas it's nadir during the Obama period. It's like as low as 17 after the
I think it's the Sean
credit
effect.
crunch. You what?
He joined and then
It was
Sean.
I joined.
When did you join, Sean?
I joined in 2020. So
it went down the toilet after that.
Yeah. If we do 100% trace there, and I'm not coming out looking so good.
No, well, there was a dip, but you've recovered.
Once I got my stride in there, you can see how well.
Yeah, no, I mean so it had a recent nadir of $241 or so in November 22, but now it's 428. So that was the time, Pierre. That was the time to buy some Microsoft. Yeah, was end of 22, mate.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the purpose of that is to describe that move. Microsoft's as big and wealthy and powerful and successful a company as ever, primarily because of that move, for which Nadella obviously has to take a lot of credit. And it's hard to argue with it when you just look at share price alone. So and one of the other things we were talking about. You were talking a lot about how this has been done, because I think there's a change in corporate culture from selling stuff to people to partnering with them and trying to empower them and that sort of thing. And I while it can sound a little bit, a bit corporate speaky, I actually think it's coherent and it makes sense, because that is the way in which you succeed as a company now, perhaps more than a few decades ago, is by all your customers succeeding. And that means that you've got to constantly adapt whatever it is that you're selling to them to make sure that it's optimal for them and they get the most out of it. And then just one other thing, having said that, all of what you said rings true to me, but for all the reasons I just stated, we talked a bit earlier about APIs, about which Microsoft's going to be one of the companies that knows a lot anyway from dealing with them for decades. And there's obviously a big industry shift going on in telecoms right now towards this network exposure that is supposed to be powered by having all these APIs that these third-party developers can then come up with all this cool stuff. In fact, recently I was just doing a bit of work this week where I was writing up a report on an interview I did at Mobile World Congress, or a panel I did at Mobile World Congress with Mavenir, you mentioned earlier. And that was on Open RAN. And one of their angles on talking up their take on Open RAN is that they're, first and foremost a software vendor. So they're coming up Open RAN from that direction. They never stated it, but I suppose the unstated comparison there is as opposed to people who are coming out from a hardware direction, by which I presume they mean like the big incumbent.
Well, they're a hardware vendor as well now.
Well, they are now, but that's what they're saying. They've come at it from a software perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean the whole thing we did. I mean, Pierre was there filming it. Was with their radios behind us.
End-to-end company. I think
End-to-end.
you'll find.
End-to-end, but with software pedigree was their point. And the network exposure and the APIs came up. So I guess that's the ultimate point, and where I'll stop banging on now and throw it back to you. Do you think that the telecoms industry is entering a similar phase where their telcos are turning into platform companies, and their future prosperity is going to depend on how much they empower other, principally B2B sort of third parties to do better, a bit like Microsoft did a decade or two ago?
Yeah. So what I'll say there, one, again, remember I joined in 2020, so this isn't firsthand experience, but I do work for the two gentlemen that actually were some of the original founders of Azure, for Jason Zander and Yusuf Halidi. Were there, and I can go by what they tell me, right? And first of all, I'll tell you that Satya is very clear that Steve Ballmer set the stage for his success, right? In terms of he did see the light, he did see the value of that. Again, so that's, again, I'm going back to what Satya here, but people do, like, one thing I noticed right away is just from a shadow of a leader perspective, the leads in Microsoft often go back to the way Satya does things, not because it's Satya and he's going to fire me if I don't, but because they've seen the change and they believe it works. And there is a lot in Microsoft. There's a very strong reinforcement of the cultural values. In other words, your ability to build on the work of others, your ability to maintain a learning mindset. And I can tell you as an employee, it's awesome, right? It really is. Like, it was a big change for me culturally from where I was previously, and I really enjoy it. It's also nice to be part of a company that most of the time when you hear them talking on publicly and stuff, we're on the right side of the issue. Like, it's just nice to be on the right side of things. I just feel the way that not just Satya, but Brad Smith and the others in the organization, when they represent what Microsoft stands for publicly, I feel good. So, not everybody feel that way. I personally find it really, and a lot of people I work with find it pretty enthusiastic. So that's it. But yes, I can tell you that sort of our conversation with the operators is like Microsoft was on fire at the stage where Satya was making changes, right? We had regulatory pressure, as you just mentioned, the stock financials. We're hoping, when the executives from Microsoft talk to the operators, we're saying, hey, before you have an existential crisis like we did, here's some of the things we did to get out of that. So if that's helpful to you in terms of how you plot your journey, like I just sat down with the leadership team at one of the Nordic telecoms just to share a little bit of the Microsoft journey and where we're going, not just from a technology perspective, but sort of a very similar conversation to we're having, to sort of say, hey, these are the things that we had to do to get out of, essentially what was an existential crisis for us. A lot of pressures in a bunch of different directions. We don't think you're there yet. We hope you never get there, but hey, this is your options. And we were kind of walking them through where we thought some of the, there's multiple dimensions to that. There is moving that mindset away from the closed user group to the notion of a large ecosystem that's open. We talked through the cultural change of moving from a know-it-all to a learn-it-all, the learning mindset adoption, that vision of focusing on adoption and then share. I don't think we have to tell telecoms about being a mission-driven organization, right? If you ever want to see a telco get their rear end in gear, watch a telco during a disaster, right? Like when I was at Verizon and, things like Katrina hit or the floods in Florida, I mean, they mobilize.
They do that well.
They are amazing. Yeah. So I don't think I have to preach to a phone company about that because they've got that down in spades. So there's a lot of cultural commonalities there. So it's just an issue of sharing the experience and helping them understand what worked for us, and then they can choose to adopt what they want to do. In terms of the network as a platform, we think as the network becomes programmable, and this is why we really feel like network APIs are important. If you want the network to be differentiated, if you want a differentiated network experience to matter, it's got to be consumable to the developers, because that controls the end user experience. And that's where I think Kamara is different from previous licensing agreements. The people that founded Kamara, and we were one of the founders, but the telcos like the Telefonicas and Deutsche Telekom and AT&T got together, understood that, hey, if we get enough of the masses, instead of slowing ourselves down in a standardization project but never sort of seems to take off, if we just get enough of us together that are sort of with enough coverage and we come up with a very practical, let's float some APIs, rather than trying to find the killer scenario up front, let's float some capabilities, see what works on, and once we have some use cases, let's drill down on them. They took some of the best practices we've learned over the years in terms of API development, and they built on that. And so I really feel like they've got a different mindset, and they realize that to get any scale, it's got to be common across the operators. So they're really focused this time on penetration and adoption versus, spilling of blood on a bunch of market share that never happens, right? Like that's, and so I really feel that they approached it with the right mindset.
Are these ones that are coming out then, the kind of APIs that we've seen being marketed so far, sometimes through, sort of telco's own stores, but are they all Kamara compliant, or?
My experience is a lot of them are, and I think what's really cool about Kamara is they shifted, right? They started down one path that said quality on demand was going to be super important. They didn't get takers. So rather than beating everybody up and explaining how quality on demand was going to be super important, they shifted and started making available the fraud stuff. Yeah. And so that's to me, that's proof points that the mentality has shifted and they're taking a much more practical, market-focused way of doing this stuff. So that's all encouraging.
That sounds like a better one to me for all than quality on demand, because quality on demand, I always sort of think begs the question, weren't we getting quality before? And I think the other problem with it is if you've got a supposed guarantee that you're getting it and you're sitting in a basement as a gamer with thick walls and the telco's using low, high band spectrum, then you're kind of, nothing's going to get around those laws of physics. But
yeah. And so for us too, like we spend a lot of money developing a developer ecosystem. There's no downside to us sort of bringing our developers together. Operators, again, they have great retail relationships. They know how to work with the government. They have strong relationships with enterprises. They don't as much interact with the developer community. There's zero downside to us sort of saying, hey, if you make this stuff available, we're happy to expose our developer community to it. Let's work together to see that. There's no downside from having a better network experience and applications that are more responsive.
So does Microsoft have its own kind? Because there's been a lot of talk about the sort of Vonage as a storefront, and AWS has talked about its kind of approach there. But is there a kind of Microsoft store for these network APIs?
So so it's Azure Marketplace.
It's Azure, right?
Okay, so we have something called Azure Programmable Connectivity, which is just basically you're welcome to publish your company's APIs to expose those to the Azure development community. Right. That's the benefit, right? We're bringing an existing Azure development community to you. Now, our friends at Vonage, and we work with them all the time, and Nicholas is a friend for a long time. He was my guy when I was at Verizon. He's over at Vonage now. So they see some business challenges with the operators in terms of billing and aggregation and stuff that they believe that they can solve for. I'm happy to plug my pieces into work with Vonage to expose that. They're adding a layer of service over top of that we don't do. Great. So if you want to use ours direct, great. If you wanted to, if you're using the Vonage services over top of that to run it, awesome. You've got Singtel, who's started Paragon, which is also a similar effort. And I think that's, same thing. They feel very confident in their knowledge of the region's requirements. They put together a rapid bundle of services. Again, I'm happy to expose that to the Microsoft developers. There's no downside. They're leaning in. They're experimenting with new models. It's quite cool stuff. There's, love to see, again, it's too early to pick, this whole obsession with killer use cases. You have to stay fluid and figure that out over time. And that's, I think, the trick to success. So I think all of these different opportunities. Nokia is doing their own thing in network APIs as well, which is pretty advanced. I can't remember what it's called. We're working closely with them as well. We, all of those.
They didn't shell out a zillion.
Well,
quid
I wonder how the kind of platforms is going to play out, because and on the sort of RIC stuff as well, because obviously in the app world that we're all more familiar with, or most people are familiar with, there's only really a couple, aren't there? That are used. Which is hence the big stories this week, partly, I guess, to do with Apple. But you kind of wonder, with these network APIs, is it going to consolidate to just a couple of these things being used internationally, or I don't know.
Well, you've got developer. The way you look at it first, right? You've got developer communities, and most of those, and many of those are established already. You can build new ones, right? That's Paragon. Vonage may build new, I think they took the NECO developer ecosystem. They may build new ones, but there's also very large established developer ecosystems that are out there today. I think just making the capability and exposing those developer ecosystems, you'll see people pick up on that. The other thing is, remember, you don't need, there's this whole concept that you need a shim layer or some multi-cloud management things. I mean, cloud brokers, you can tell me if you think that business model ever worked out. I'm not it's not immediately obvious to me.
Cloud brokers.
Yeah, which is basically a shim layer that does that.
What's I don't know
Yeah, I
what
don't
that
know what
is.
that is.
Basically, I got 1, 2, 3, and I stick something in between, and sort of trying to route everything through.
Like a kind of abstraction. sort of
Yeah,
thing.
which
Middleware or something.
right, which I don't think panned out particularly well. It may yet, so I could be wrong there.
It leads to those fucking software diagrams that you get on PowerPoint with tons of rectangles.
Isn't
They
this
really
kind
do
of
my
how
head in.
people like sort of Red Hat pitch themselves partly though, is we can be the abstraction layer between the hyperscaler platforms.
I'll let them do their pitch. They're good partners. We work with them. We work with VMware. It's awesome. What I will say is that, with containerization and Kubernetes, you've got a lot of portability built into the underlying modules already. So that gives you a lot of options. Back to your resiliency conversation before, right? We're big believers in moving things to containerization. On our AO5GC product, part of the reason we bought Affirmed, not just to get the skills in-house, was to be able to create a showcase for what cloud-native technologies could become. So with the Affirm software, which is now AO5GC, which again rolls off the tongue, Azure Operator 5G Core.
There's a lot in our space that really rolls off the tongue.
Is that what it's sort of rebranded to now?
Yeah. It's not just rebranded.
Is.
So what it is it took these firm software and rewrote it from scratch up as Microsoft software. So it's built on the Microsoft code line. It uses Microsoft coding standards. So it's all.
So it's changed a lot since the takeover.
It's extended. Yeah, and it was great baseline software, but it had to be rewritten to meet. Just Microsoft is a different way of building things. So we had to be, and anything you sell as a Microsoft branded product has to meet those standards. So that's been rebuilt as AO5GC, but it's fully containerized, and as it containerized, it has a couple of advantages. Like, for example, it's microservices based, so I can put 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G functionality all into one implementation.
Right.
The user plane function, because it uses containerization and parallelism, is super efficient, right? It's one of the most efficient. If you were to ask sort of some of the folks that deployed DN, it routinely ranks as one of the most efficient deployments on the planet. The automation that we use took several of the things, and you can see our friends who've implemented this before describing activities that used to take weeks and days to implement can now be done in minutes and hours. So we're really seeing that value. So I can take that and use that, not just to say, hey, look, Microsoft's super cool, but I can take it to my partners and say, here's what good looks like. Here's what you can get as a benefit. Here's the added value you're going to give to your customers. And so I think that's been a big plus. And so I think having, that combination of, we're big fans of cloud native software techniques, big fans of containerization for obvious reasons. And I think that starts helping you get some of that floating across the different layers without sort of, again, just the use of a shim layer brings you the lowest common denominator, because you're always waiting for them to build every new function into the abstraction layer. Whereas containerization relieves you of some of that burden, and I think is a much more effective way to go.
How did Metaswitch sort of fit into the picture?
Metaswitch was leaders in software-defined networking for voice services, and so we have a lot of the, we still resell the Metaswitch as a third-party option, which means it's sold on Metaswitch paper, not Microsoft paper. And for example, the technology for Metaswitch was critical to that voice fraud detection, the Azure Call Protect service that we did before. We were able to actually essentially take, for example, their SBC, turn it into a cloud native function in Microsoft code base, and then use that to do the interface with the voice network. So, and a lot of the expertise, like there's, Metaswitch has a long, proud history of innovation. We got a lot of smart engineers in nearby here, right? Here in the UK, and so there's a ton of engineering talent there that was coming up with some very, very cool software, which is the Azure Call Protect stuff. So we really see a lot of value in that the acquisitions, those skill sets, and it's coming out in the innovative products that we're putting to the table.
I've got to mention something in the context of Metaswitch. The guy who organised you coming over and getting on this pod is called Steve Gleave. He's probably listening. All right, Steve. I've never met him face to face, but we've emailed.
He's awesome.
We've emailed a lot. And he, I've just reminded myself, came over with the Metaswitch acquisition. So he's a Brit living in the States.
Yeah.
And we've had a few little scheduling sort of to and fro's, and he's been great. So hi, Steve.
He used to work with Phil, I think.
He used to work with Phil. Was Phil at Metaswitch?
Phil was at Metaswitch.
Shit, I forgot about that.
Phil Harvey.
Yeah, Phil Harvey, the editor of Light Reading.
Yeah.
Right, so they know each other. Yeah, Steve is a part of the very niche, tiny community of people who've read my fiction book that I published, so I'm especially grateful to him for that, and he had kind words to say about
Phil Harvey?
No, Steve. I don't think Phil has. Although he should.
I don't know if he even knows about it.
No,
But
I'll have a
you
word
have to
with him.
mention it
Next
to
time
him.
I can get
Yeah.
a word in edgeways when I'm chatting to him.
Something to do with guitars? I'm just guessing from your teeth.
No, metal comes up once or twice, but no, I won't bore you with it now. Well, you can ask Steve.
I will
Get
ask- I will
the
ask
review of
Steve.
him when you chat to him.
Fantastic.
But anyway, I wanted to give him a shout out. I was going to say, you're not the first person that I've heard from Microsoft talking about this quite flexible, collaborative, hybrid approach to cloud, which is often the best objection. If me or both of us are steaming in with this sort of like hyperscaler vendor lock-in objection, that's some of the best response to that.
You'll still be logged in.
You can still be locked. I'm not saying it's infallible. I'm not saying it's watertight. I'm just saying it's a good response. But yeah, by all means, address that in a sec, Ian. But I'm just wondering, do you think you're more like that than your direct competitors, AWS and Google Cloud? How do you, when you're chatting to people, how do you compare yourself to them?
One of the features that we built into the Nexus offering,
And get closer to them.
So one of the features we built in the Nexus offering that's a direct set of feedback from various operators around this is something we call break glass. So essentially, for the most part, in the end, if there's some asteroid hits the Earth, horrible disaster, the operator has to be able to roll in and seize control. And so with a pure public cloud option, obviously that's not feasible. With a hybrid cloud option, in the break glass model, essentially the operator can say, I need to take this over. I need to be running this, and they can migrate it back to their control. Now we pull that machine out of the fleet. It no longer really has access into the cloud because we don't control it anymore, but the operator can re-seize control of it and run it themselves. And so that's an important feature differentiator that I know we have.
Is there like a financial implication of doing it though?
Yeah,
They
I mean,
pay for it in a
there's
different way.
operations and
Right.
financial implications of doing it. But in the end, like, let's face it, I'm probably not fair. Like, if it's a
I didn't even
scenario
know
like
about
that,
Yeah.
if it's a scenario like that, they got some kind of catastrophic event, we're probably not thinking about whether or not we're going to charge their credit card, right? Like, we're probably going to just figure out how to make sure
They have to have a good
service is
reason to do
maintained.
it.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I'm presuming they're not just doing it because they got up on a Tuesday and felt like, let's see if this works, right? But like, but in the end, right, we have to be able to assure, these folks are answerable to the regulators, they're answerable to the company and their shareholders, and they've got to make sure they have adequate levels of control. Now that took some designing, right? That's easy to say, it's tough to design. That took some time to get done, but that break glass feature is an important component of it. And that's what the hybrid model lets us do.
Yeah.
So when we focus on the hybrid model, that gives us more control to do that. So, there's elements of the UK TSA that require components like that we have or will conform with. We just announced we'd be Nessus certified. We're not yet, but we will be. So that's compliance with sort of some of the things that were come up as part of the GSMA. So yeah, it's an evolving. I mean, this is critical national infrastructure. There's going to be evolving changes, and we've learned a lot in terms of our work with the different operators in the different regions and what needs to get done. Different policy implementations, similar underlying technology requirements. It's all part about staying humble and listening, is to learn that stuff. And I think that's one thing we're good at. And I think that's some of the feedback I've gotten from customers, that when we roll in the door, we're not there to tell it how to, we're here to fix you and move you to the cloud, right?
Yep.
We're here to bring the cloud to you, understand what you need to make it work, and work together with you. Now, does that mean we're going to 100% move to a non-cloud model? Doesn't make any sense. You're not getting leverage then. But on the flip side, most of the time when we sit down and learn, we can come up with the best of breed approach between the two. And it's been very effective with the operators that we've done it with.
Yeah, it all makes sense. I mean, it's a good answer, but you slightly swerved the matter of competitive messaging. How does an operator, or anyone for that matter, but obviously we're talking about it in a telco, how do they choose? I mean, I wouldn't know where to start, but that's fine. I'm not an expert. How do they choose? I mean, you've touched on some of the things, some of the reasons they might have gone there, but I still think AWS is still the market leader in terms of total share, if I'm not wrong. So there must be a reason why
So
sometimes
Microsoft's probably been the one that's grown the most.
Microsoft on the better trajectory, is it?
Yeah.
Well,
so what I'll say in this space, so in our space, what I'll tell you, what I tell the differentiators we highlight are from the perspective of just moving to a cloud model. We believe you save between 36 and 38%. That's the Analysis Mason report that we did on total cost of ownership in terms of versus, say, what we call DIY cloud. We think there's a 58% savings in terms of OpEx from automation, certification, and simplification. So, there's a big savings on that side.
and what are these costs as a sort of percentage of the the overall costs of an operator? I know it's probably really hard to say.
Yeah,
but
no,
is
it's yeah. I'm very confident in those numbers, and I would have to make up the numbers for that answer, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to. But I can come back to you with that.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'll point out is, listen, we're the only, we have 70 plus million subscribers on Microsoft technology for AT&T today, right? So we've got tens of millions of subs in AT&T. You know, we've got, you know, we're one of the few people who've got more than one tier one operator network moving onto our platform, right? And we're actually deployed in service. Versus some networks that maybe haven't launched as aggressively as people maybe thought. You know, you see a lot of stuff out there. There are backup networks and secondary networks, but we're really the people that have a tier one operator on the cloud. The other thing I'll point out is we have the largest B2B partner ecosystem out there. When it comes to monetizing stuff, we've got a model demonstrated to make that happen. We've got the largest partner ecosystem by far, and we're pretty happy to stand behind that. From a security and certification perspective, we have more security certs and certifications than any other hyperscaler out there. This is an area that we're comfortable with. It's an area we've had to deal with in the past, so we're probably very sensitive to it. And and then finally, what I'll say is that sort of our, you know, my belief is that we're earlier leaders in hybrid compute, and so we believe in that a little bit more. And then I think some of the other solutions maybe don't have a similar philosophy. So I still think when you look under the covers and you look at the experience level and the actual implementation approach, I think you will see differences. Now the challenge, you know, that's like, you know, one apple telling you it's different from another apple in some regards, right? So people may not see that, but for the folks that do this for a living, I think when they look at the underlying capabilities, they'll see a strong difference in the way that the way we've approached our design philosophy, say the way that my friends at AWS have approached it. And versus the Red Hats and the VMwares of the world. And so that, you know, as I said, those are the things that we believe differentiate us when I talk to folks.
Do you see, because the core is obviously quite advanced, I think, in terms of virtualization and running it on the cloud now, but if you look at the RAN, it's not at all. It's all pretty much physical still. But do you have sort of similar numbers where someone virtualizing that and then moving it? So let's say there's a future where a lot of the Nokia stuff and Ericsson stuff is running on Nexus and operators are doing that. Is there a kind of similar cost comparison that you've done, or
it's not. That will be a fundamental part of when we go to.
That's the next analysis Mason paper.
If I pre-announce, I'll get killed. But let's.
There goes your scoop, Ian.
We're not immune to the fact that we're not ignorant of the fact that people have to see TCO models to make decisions realistically. So I think we're going to be, we have to be aware of that, right? That's part of the design is making sure that you're designing something that makes sense for people, and that's part of the cost is definitely a part of that. So understanding, I mean, when you say TCO model, it's also part of understanding where the business benefits derived, right? So TCO model is pretty trite, and you say, oh, it's just dollars, but it's not. Like if you do a TCO model properly, you're figuring out where you're actually adding business value. And I think there's a lot of discipline around that. And so, and in particular with RAN, a lot of our conversations with the Ericssons and the Nokias of the world, and is to sit down and say, okay, what real value we're bringing here? What's the real world impact of this stuff? Right. Obviously, I believe very strongly in the innovation, the security, and the automation aspects of it. But let's talk about the specific use cases as it applies to. And I'll give you an example. Some of the things that we showcased at Mobile World Congress, where we were able to take, everybody talks about the scenario where, hey, we shut down the power on the cell sites at night.
Yeah.
We actually, we adjust power utilization in the cloud real time, like constantly changing the wattage on the server based on the incoming workload real time. Well, we partnered with our friends at Capgemini with the former Altran software, along with Intel and their power management software, along with the algorithms we use on our side. And we were able to sew that up together and show you real-time power management. I think there's...
Does that rely... Again, I'm remembering the panel I did with Mavenir, just because I've been writing it up this week, so it's sort of fresh in my mind. And when you're transcribing a video, you end up listening to each passage about 4 or 5 times, so it really fucking sinks in. They were talking about that sort of dynamic powering up and powering down and sleep mode, and they were leaning quite heavily on AI as a driver of that, and that does seem like an interesting thing. Again, I'm not an engineer, but my understanding is historically networks were just up because they had to be up.
Yeah.
Whereas if you've got clever AI that just says, well, hold on a sec, no one's rung anyone up, well, not that anyone rings anyone up anymore, no one's used the network for a bit, let's just power down. But then you've got the mechanisms in there to power it up immediately. Bit like, reminds me a bit of, I remember when I first encountered cars, quite a lot of like cars, yeah. When I first encountered cars, yeah.
When was that, Scott?
Cars, comma. Where when you're at the lights, it turns the engine off.
Yeah.
Oh, the start. Yeah, it's so annoying.
Well, but if it's done well, it's not annoying.
You have to wait at least for a minute, but if you wait 10 seconds, you consume more in it.
Yeah, well, like my car, I've just got a shitty second-hand Ford Focus, and it's supposedly got that, but it's rubbish, and it doesn't do it half the time. But slightly posher cars, I think they do it quite well, and that's just an example of that, using smarts to just go, what's the point in turning the engine over if you're going to be still for 30 seconds?
Is there a Microsoft equivalent? Because when AWS talks about the sort of vRAN side of things and work they're doing with Nokia, they're always sort of keen to advertise these Graviton chips that they're, and you can put some of the RAN software on that. And is there a kind of Microsoft equivalent of that? Or?
So that's another area where we talk about differentiation. Microsoft uses off-the-shelf hardware.
We
use
it's proper x86. And
we use
COTS.
partners like COTS. We
learned
use
that the other day as well.
Today we've got a platform based on Dell, Arista, and Pure Software, and so Pure Storage, and so Nexus is the platform. So you have a Nexus form factor applicable for enterprise workloads, private RAN, private networks, RAN and packet core. You've got the far edge platform, which is more applicable to where, for example, you stick the VDU or the VCU in the VDU, depending on when you're doing CRAN or DRAN.
Yeah.
You've got the Nexus Near Edge, which is the first release, which is the stuff we're doing with the packet core, and other functions will sit on there: subscriber, GI LAN, virtual base gate, VBNG. On the wireline side. So you've got that, but it's the same platform. So essentially you've got different hardware configurations or loadouts, but that's abstracted, right? Because it's all the same APIs, it's the same platform layer across the top of that. So you're talking the same set of software.
So is it all x86 based then?
Yeah, it is.
There's not an ARM option in there at the
Not
moment.
yet.
Right.
Not yet, but that's not inconceivable, right? But it's not.
Would it be someone like Ampere maybe, or?
Yeah, we haven't.
Yeah,
the people working. I'm not the guy working on that. So I need to go. I know they've gone.
Fucking drop it.
Yeah. No, you can ask all the questions. Again, I have this thing about not making stuff up when I'm being recorded.
No,
so
you're old fashioned that way.
I am funny that way, but so obviously that's we have customers pushing for that. So certainly can look at it. But right now we've had great success with the Intel folks, and they've been very good to work with.
Yeah.
So we've got that, but definitely And then from a hardware, in the RAN side, there is a very distinct difference between the way Nokia and Ericsson are approaching the use of smart cards and NICs, and so we support both of those, right? That's the one sort of variation layer where we're not going to pick a side, right? They're both experts in this area. Our platform.
So with Nokia, it's coming along and sticking their smart NIC for layer 1 into a server. You can support
we already support smart NICs on the platform, so the question is can we support that one? And the answer is, we're going to work with both of them. We're not going to force. We're not going to pick sides there. And so both of them have distinct philosophies on how that should work. And
they're quite religious about it as well.
And guys, that's not, again, it's all about I'm good at platforms, right? I know what I invest in. I know what I'm good at. Yeah. I got partners that know their way around the RAN stuff. We're going to listen and take guidance from them.
But it doesn't make management of it harder, the approaches they take in terms of the CAS layer? Or?
If you look at sort of, obviously any variation underneath, it causes some challenge. But I mean, that if you look at sort of Hit Refresh, which is Satya Nadella's book, he talks about the value of that fundamental layering between hardware and platform and software. And, and those principles are getting applied at the Nexus layer. I won't pretend we're never probably going to do mix and match hardware completely. I mean, at least not in the near future, but doesn't mean we won't support variations and options.
Yeah.
We could at this stage, I mean, we're running into about the last half hour of the pod anyway. We tend to go on for about 2 hours. I hope I warned you in advance. Okay. And we could go and quickly cover some news, but I just think there's so much cool stuff that we're talking about in terms of your core area. And this is something I'm actually trying to discipline myself to do, is sometimes if the main topic is interesting, don't force a bit of news discussion. So if it's all right with you two, I'll just keep talking about the main thing. One thing I wanted to ask, which is related, I just noticed your job title on LinkedIn just says VP 5G strategy.
Yeah.
And one thing Ian and I have both written about a lot, and I once more reflected after Mobile World Congress this year is, and there's been other stuff on Telecoms.com. In fact, I should shout out, talking about Mobile World Congress and our respective sites, that if you want to know more from Sean, Mike Dano from Light Reading, Ian's colleague, did a video interview from Mobile World Congress with him. So we're sort of like the English, more drunken versions of Mike Dano. But yeah, there's a cool one there. Although, do you know what? I played it on my phone. I wonder if it works here. I'll turn the volume on. I played it on my phone and no volume came through on that Light Reading video. I'm going to see.
It's me at my best.
No, it's Pierre's fault. That's fine here. So it was just something weird about my phone then. So it's not your fault, Pierre.
Oh, thank you.
Anyway, what I was going to ask, just talking more broadly about 5G, for about the last 5 years, we've been asking the question, the sort of show me the money question.
Yeah.
And this year I still ask the question, but I slightly moderated my tone in so much as I used to position it in a slightly more, come on, telecoms, get your shit together.
You're asking the wrong question.
We still don't know what the point is. Well, let me finish asking it, and then you can tell me whether it's right or wrong. Whereas this year I sort of went, well, fair enough. It's just a slow burner, and it's taking a long time to sort of manifest the commercial point of it. There's a few little early use cases like fixed wireless access, which just take advantage of the fatter pipe that it brings and that sort of thing. But as we've just spent an hour and a half talking about how a lot of your job is to empower telcos and to empower the telecoms world. Well, they're still not making that much money out of 5G. But what grounds for optimism do we have that they will eventually?
Yeah. So a couple things there, right? So from our perspective, you got to, 5G takes time to roll out, right? Just coverage takes time to roll out. You got a device ecosystem that's got to roll out. When people talk about it, sort of all the industrial engineering and OT stuff that was supposed to take place, right? Where are we with progress in scaling the size of the 5G modules, right? Not just the 5G handsets, but the modules that underpin that. That's still work in progress. So to some extent, it's sort of, the question is how long is it going to take the ecosystem to I want to say that the device ecosystem to roll out. The other things a lot of people remember is a lot of those specialized capabilities that were going to take place with 5G were not part of 5G NR, which is what people did first, right? They got a lot of benefit out of doing the new radio upgrades that gave them, more capacity and more capabilities. So that had some initial advantage. But people are just getting to 5G SA now, which is where some of these specialized capabilities in. So it's a little early to tell. What I will say is obviously there was a lot of hype around sort of private networks, which I think there are some super cool things being done right now. I mean, we again, with our friends at TampNet and Pegatron, who have been some early adopters there. The Pegatron folks are doing some very cool things with manufacturing software throughout Asia and 5G radios, and the TampNet folks have started to deploy 5G solutions to their customers in the North Sea. So there's, essentially turning rigs and boats into smart cities, for lack of a better term. So they're doing some very cool stuff there, but it hasn't, it didn't, you can look at the financials and say whether or not for every carrier that had a big impact. So I think it's a little early for that. Remember, 4G had that same challenge, right? Especially, LTE evolution was people were questioning it for a while. Now you wouldn't live without it. So that may take a while to roll out.
But the narrative around 4G was still, I think, a lot clearer and more linear, which is just proper mobile broadband.
Yeah. So what I'll say is the green shoots.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. So what I'll say is the green shoots. The two things that I point to is, again, you see the excitement we've got around AI. You see the stuff that we started, the work we did with BT and experimenting with sort of bringing AI into the core network itself is pretty exciting. There's a raft of cool ideas behind that. So you've got some green shoots that say, hey, here's something we practically see, that we could potentially monetize. So there's some optimism around that. With the network APIs, right? So if you look at sort of the work that was done by, the three operators in Brazil, Claro, TIM, and Telefonica, the typical bank in Brazil has got between a $70 and $100 million fraud exposure. They're monetizing telemetry data, SIM age data, and location data to pass into the banks to help manage that fraud problem. They're making money off of it. So there are green shoots out there. You can't point at the numbers and say there's a clear win, right?
And there isn't a killer app or anything like that.
Right. But there are some, and again, there was a lot of hype around, edge compute I still think there is a ton of opportunity in edge compute, but remember, you're solving a super complicated problem. If you think of it, to get the edge compute scenarios to work, you've got to teach enterprises to use 5G networks, which is a little harder than Wi-Fi. There's clear advantages, right, in terms of security, latency, and coverage, but it's still an uphill there. And on top of that, you've got, these OT scenarios, these operational technology scenarios require highly refined knowledge of specialized business processes and in many cases specialized technology. Just finding someone who can assemble all those bits and then scale it to real business takes time. And so, it's not surprising to me that didn't just boom first day into a massive business. It's going to play out. What we're seeing is definitively in cases where people don't have coverage today, but there's a lot of technology in motion, or there's a lot of equipment in motion in locations, that there's definite use cases for that. So do I see that taking off? Yes. Do I see it being a little slower than everybody would like? Absolutely. So the question is, will that scale to meet the investment that was put into it? And that's a different thing. The other thing is we think as people deploy 5G SA, there's some advantages in terms of carrier aggregation that occurs to the consumer unit. But we really see the possibility of doing a split off of sort of a 5G B2B SA core only, which means you could develop a different set of experiences. And then that comes with, if you're going to monetize services, you have to have a fully software definable network. So it has to be composable, right? I'm building services through software. I have to expose the APIs because I have to get the developers to be able to program against it, the extended developer ecosystem. And then I need AI to manage it at scale. In other words, if I just put traditional telco NOC people to manage all these individual business processes at scale, I'll go back. The service will be undoable. It'll be too expensive or challenging. So if I can use AI to streamline that, and then I've got a chance of getting that. So we see the elements in place to manage that. Now, as we get more of these services out and as people are deploying SA and the device ecosystem, we see green shoot opportunities. But definitely there's some road to hoe there.
Fair enough. That's fair enough. Am I asking the wrong question, Ian?
Well, I just think that's the sort of question a telco would ask.
Right. Show me the money.
No, monetization of 5G. Like when we've talked about this loads of times on recent pods, why should consumers care about 5G?
Yeah.
And if it doesn't do any, I mean, the question is, why are they still marketing these network developments that are basically just an upgrade of the pipes? It's like you care about the water that comes out of your tap. You don't care about the pipe behind it. As long as it works, you just want to get the water out. The water's the application, I suppose, in the telco world. People care about the service on top of it. They don't care about the underlying technology. So, I take the points about APIs, and if it's an SA, maybe a different thing because it could throw up some new sort of uses. But I think one of the problems the telcos have is still thinking in terms of Gs.
Yes.
This is something they need to try and commercialize rather than thinking what services should we do. And people still pay a lot of money to use 5G, but they don't pay on top of their 4G network to do it. That's the problem.
But why everybody did the rush to market 5G first, right? Because that was the 4G experience. The carriers that released 4G early, the 4G experience was so much better than the 3G experience. They lowered their cost of customer acquisition. This is a very straightforward numbers thing. So if you were the first to market with 4G, your cost of customer acquisition plummeted. You have to do a lot to get people to move. So there was a definite early mover advantage with 4G.
Right. Because so like EE would have had that in the UK, wouldn't it?
Right. So and I just know from the Verizon obviously capitalized on that pretty aggressively.
But I can't remember, was Verizon quite early?
Yeah, Verizon, there's a clear, you can see it in the financial metrics about sort of what the impact of Verizon's decision on the network early was. Yeah. And so everybody learned from it. People aren't dumb, right? They can learn from success and try to repeat it. So there was definitely an attempt to repeat that in 5G. Obviously, it didn't work quite the same that time for a number of reasons. Yeah. So there was some sense. People weren't crazy doing that. They were trying to follow a strategy that had worked before. It just didn't execute the way that they'd hoped. Yeah,
I completely agree. That's completely consistent with my more anecdotal view.
So now the question is given where they're at, can you what are the characteristics of 5G that you can use to generate value? And I still think it's early days because people haven't, SA deployment in particular isn't out there yet, and the efficiencies that they got on the on the RAN side and the experience in the RAN side helped them solve existing challenges and, many cases helped to deal with coverage cases. So they got value out of it.
Yeah.
Question is whether that translated into economic value or just staved off the fact that if you're a phone company, your problem is there's an ever demanding, increasing demand for your service. It's not like they're offering something that people don't want.
Yeah.
It's just the price to provide that flattens out. So the cost of providing the service versus the revenue you can recognize it is just, it's cracking that equation.
I mean, even if 5G does bring along if it brings along the opportunity to do things with fishing boats, let's say, or with factories that nobody's ever paid for before, and then that's fresh revenue for the telcos, great, and that's what they want. But from a consumer point of view, where's it going to go? Like you spend, this is what I don't, this is a problem they have, is that like what do telcos need to do? They need to start selling energy or banking services or something else, because people are only going to pay a certain amount for connectivity each month, and it's just going down all the time. They're not going to pay, you're still going to use a smartphone, or maybe in the future you have a Vision Pro. I don't know what it might be, but even then, probably that gets bundled in with a smartphone contract and it gets sold for not
Talking
much.
about Vision Pro, I did see an interesting thing on LinkedIn. There's a guy that I think I've interviewed at Mobile Congress before when he used to work at Qualcomm called Philippe Poggianti, something like that.
Right.
And he's just left and he started to do his own thing. And he put some post up, maybe he's being an analyst or something, and he put up some bit of insight. You know how we're always talking about how when people try and come up with a differentiating use case for 5G being low latency and how that's handy for VR.
Which it might be, but the operators are going to make money out of that.
Well, yeah,
that's the problem.
That's fine, but one thing I learnt from him, which maybe I should have known already, because one of the pushbacks we've always had is like you're only going to use VR indoors anyway, which will be on Wi-Fi.
I mean, actually, that's one they might make a bit of money out of.
So, well, let me just quickly finish before both of you chip in. The one thing I learnt from Philippe's post on LinkedIn is that you can't get. You know how if you get latency wrong on VR, you end up throwing up all over yourself because you just get this.
Apparently.
Yeah. And apparently. I mean, I've never experienced it, thankfully. But apparently you can't get that from Wi-Fi. So my objection that, not in that context.
You can't get it on Wi-Fi?
Apparently you can't. Apparently it's harder or impossible or less likely. I can't remember how Philippe put it. But getting that kind of low latency that you need for VR to make you not yak all over yourself is a lot harder on Wi-Fi than it is on 5G. So that's a differentiator, even in that VR context. Were you going to say something about that?
Well, the other thing, I think, so this is speculation or supposition on my part.
Look him up on LinkedIn. But what I have a problem with it.
Yeah,
he's giving me skeptical looks.
Well, you're going to be on a fiber connection. So what are you going to use the 5G for?
The point is less deterministic. So the interface, the air interface on the Wi-Fi is less deterministic than it is on
exactly.
On
right. It's the air interface.
So you have a 5G hotspot in the house, maybe, rather than
Wi-Fi. But the trick for the other thing is you look at the adoption rates of Wi-Fi connected equipment in the home. Like, last I checked, and again, I could be super wrong on here, but when I looked at this a little while ago when I was at Verizon, the number of folks who have smart devices in their home that don't connect them because they can't be fussed with the Wi-Fi interface, et cetera, is fairly large.
Cough, plume, cough.
Right. So the question is the challenge to the operators might be can you get cellular connectivity be ubiquitous enough and simple enough that it can be embedded at the manufacturer level so it just happens without the consumer having to do anything? Can you guarantee the security such that the user's identity is associated with that and it's safe and they don't feel intruded upon? Such that you just encourage the adoption of more and more smart things, whether it's a smart vacuum cleaner or smart air freshener or smart refrigerator or whatever smart thing you want in the home. Today, if people have those features, but they don't activate them, you're not going to monetize them. That's just a bunch of extra hardware for no cash. And you're right, the carrier can't monetize that. But if you can provide a smoother, cleaner experience where people are used to using it, your opportunity to monetize that is higher. So again, I see opportunities for the operators to do this. Now it's predicated on making a lot of things true, but there are places that they can play and succeed at for sure. And I think there's smart people working on it. So we'll see. There's lots of room There's a lot of concepts. The challenge you got in telecoms, there's a lot of things that get talked about for 10 years and don't happen. By the way, a lot of the advancements in Gen AI were things, they're not concepts that are new. They just didn't have the horsepower and you didn't have the compute power and a couple of the smart algorithms to make them happen. Now you can make it happen.
So
right?
the Gen AI company that's the company that's most associated with Gen AI, obviously Microsoft has a close relationship with, which is OpenAI. And I was just listening to a podcast with a guy called Lex Friedman, who had Sam Altman on. And it was really interesting. I mean, part of it is they were talking about stuff I'm sure you're aware of, where they had all this massive corporate melodrama going on a few months ago at OpenAI, which all got resolved partly by Microsoft stepping in. But apart from that, he was just talking. He's obviously one of the people. And the interviewer is also an AI person. And so they were talking at quite a high level about this, that, and the other, ethics, what it produces, what it can do. And I thought for anyone who's listening, that's really worth listening to, just as a sort of sense of where the thinking of someone who's right at the vanguard of all this stuff is going. And I think that a lot of the drama was about what they call AGI, artificial general intelligence. And that's where I step in and get all Terminator-y and like, oh fuck, the machines are taking over. And
well, that's not what they're doing though.
No, but I think part of the palpitations were shit, maybe we're getting close, and maybe we haven't got all the guardrails and the ethical frameworks in place for when Skynet does take over. I mean, there's even a product called Skynet that's in, that's not helping, is it?
Well, of course. I mean, that was like in the Bitcoin days where people just put bit in front of stuff and their stock tripled.
Right, there we go. So there
know,
was a lot of that at Mobile Congress this year where everyone had to have an AI angle, didn't they?
The AI verse.
I mean, that
Cyberdyne,
sounds like total hype. That's like, I think because Nvidia is obviously in the news a lot this week because they had their big conference, and I think even what's his name, Jensen Huang, was saying, we're 5 years away from artificial general intelligence. But
he said that in public, did he?
Yeah, but nobody believes it. I mean, it's just drumming up.
It's a big jump from where we are now.
I was going to ask you actually,
it's like self-driving cars. We're always 10 years away.
Totally,
right,
exactly.
Elon Musk said that, so many times.
Now I was going to ask you because Nvidia is obviously like Microsoft's a big customer of Nvidia, and the story about them up till now has been putting these GPUs into hyperscaler facilities and training large language models, and people are talking more about AI inference, and then Nvidia's trying to pitch this model where the telcos get involved. You could maybe put them at the edge of the network, but is there a model where someone like Microsoft comes along and, with your Nexus platform that you're building out closer to the telco edge, that you would introduce those GPUs and use them for applications there where you can run part of the RAN on it maybe, but also do other things as well? Because that's something they're trying to sell.
Yeah,
I know.
So I don't want to contribute to the hype. So what I'm going to say is, listen, AI is a pretty fundamental component of what we're doing with Nexus. In other words, bringing the ability to invoke AI services from the network itself. That's very different than running a engine at the edge. So I won't, putting GPUs to run engines at the edge, which is not something we've announced yet, or right. So definitely AI is a big play in there. Is there an opportunity to do that as we move forward? Absolutely. We'll see how the technology evolves. What I will say is like with the AI Copilot work we're doing, where we show how we use an AI Copilot to help the operator, the NOC operator, manage stuff. What sits underneath that is multiple models, right? It's not like it doesn't just all go to GPT-4 or 5 or 3.5. We use Codex, which is...
There's no 5 yet, according to Sam Altman.
There's no 5 yet, so again, don't contribute to that. But what sits underneath that is the ability to sort of decompose the prompt and direct it to the right sort of underlying language model, whether it's an SLM. If you've got, for example, Deutsche Telekom, SKT want to build a telco LLM. We've got a Codex, which is the GitHub-oriented stuff. We've got GPT, which is the generalized model. I think the solutions we're building now use a multiplicity of underlying capabilities to solve for that problem. That leaves open the opportunity for stuff like that to happen. Now, if it evolves out that drives value, like it makes sense to do that, awesome, right? And if you saw Brad Smith did a talk, again, at Mobile World Congress, and again last week he talked about sort of having the proper regulation in place, having the proper governor to say, hey, this went too far. We've got ability to fix things, right? So I think people are thinking through that in a very principled way. And so that's, I think people are acknowledging those fears, acknowledging the fears of folks like yourself that see the dystopian stuff.
I know it can be a bit hyperbolic and hysterical, but Jesus Christ, the closer we get to it.
But we're not, I don't know what you mean closer we get to it.
We must be getting closer just by virtue of the passage of time.
But you're talking as though the developments that are happening with GPT are bringing us closer to artificial general intelligence.
Not in and of themselves.
It's like creating a person, yeah.
I suppose that's one way of looking at it.
So what's being done at the moment is not being
but the AGI stuff's happening in parallel. Honestly, listen to this Sam Altman, podcast. That's definitely where they're heading.
All that stuff.
If it's happening in parallel, it's nothing to do with what they're doing with generative AI, though, because that's just pattern recognition stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's like
and just adding more processing capability all the time.
I agree that the Gen AI is in parallel to AGI, but it's generated a lot of hype and investment in like infrastructure, which is why if you're a Nokia shareholder, you're doing even better than if you're a Microsoft shareholder. Not Nokia, Nvidia.
You're definitely not doing better as a Nokia.
No, shareholder. Not so good. I am. My 20 quid's not looking so good with them right now. But I think we are headed that way, and you get, I didn't even know Jensen Huang had said that we're 5 years away, and maybe that was just bollocks. Maybe he's just. I
think he was doing his little bit for the share price there, maybe.
Well, he doesn't need to. This is the one time he doesn't need to froth.
He might not need to at the moment, but everybody's wondering when it's like we can't go up forever. So
again, it's back to listen. You got to acknowledge the fact that people are concerned. You have to have a principled structure with how you're going to deal with it. You have to have, it's legitimate for, I think our position is legitimate for people to look at that and say, does it make sense to have a regulatory framework around it? Again, regulatory
The EU's giving that a good go right now, isn't it?
A round table.
Yeah, whichever. It's
can't be a good round table.
It's there's going to be discussion on it. There should be, and a principled approach has to be taken. And so I think, as I said, and then another thing that I think you don't want to miss out of this, and this is another big chunk of what Brad Smith talked about at Mobile World Congress, is the ability of multiple economies to participate in that. So, for example, I was out meeting with one of the ministers of telecom in Southeast Asia, and they're very excited about the opportunity to turn, to move to a digital economy. And they're willing to invest in terms of their education systems and the way that they incent investment in the country, and that's exciting stuff. Like think about your ability to change the structure of how people create opportunities in certain countries, and there's no reason that these folks shouldn't have the right to participate in that. So
there's so many like broader geopolitical and demographic things. Like right now a lot of countries, US and Europe, there's a lot of topical stuff around immigration. Imagine if you were able to empower continents like Africa or regions like Southeast Asia such that the pressure to leave those places to come to the more developed countries wasn't there because they were empowered in the way you just described through participation in the digital economy.
Yeah. Again, when I talk about the fact that sometimes I'm proud to be part of Microsoft and see things on the right side, you look at sort of some of the participation in Satya and Microsoft in some of the initiatives in Africa, for example, and some of the work we've done in India, et cetera, and other areas of the world. I mean, Satya has a very global mindset in a way that it's not condescending or, it's truly about figuring out how to use technology to empower everyone, and that just raises the bar and evens the playing field. And that feels good to be in part of a company that thinks that way.
Cool. We're about to wrap up. I've got one other angle that I quickly want to talk about. What are you nodding?
Nothing.
You seem to think that you know what it is. I don't think it probably is now.
No, I'm just saying. You're saying about to wrap up. Like,
You
okay.
better wrap up.
He's got another Canadian joke in there.
Are you the one who's got the hard stop? Is it?
No.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, but we'll make it like 10 minutes max from here, if that's all right with everyone.
It is, although I probably wouldn't be coming out to the pub if it's much more than 10 minutes.
All right, well, I'll make it less than fucking 10 minutes then, won't I? Jesus Christ, it's only 3 in the afternoon.
I know, but I need to get somewhere by a specific time.
Okay, just very quickly then. Very quickly, Sean. No pressure. Your job title's VP 5G strategy.
Yeah.
Do you think in 10 years or even 5 years, your job title will be VP 6G strategy? And if so, do you think that would be a good development? What the underlying thing is, I increasingly think, as to what we were talking about earlier, especially what Ian was saying, I think the G's are sort of largely bollocks now.
Yeah.
And I think going to another G, I think 5G was a stretch. In terms of the utility of it, I understand that we need to conceptualize generations, but in terms of the utility of 5G, I think we've all agreed in this room that it's had limited utility in terms of communicating with the outside world. Isn't that going to be even more the case with 6G?
So you focused on the different part of the title than I do. So
I know.
6 years from
Well,
now,
it's
I wanna
just
be
there on
EVP,
LinkedIn.
EVP of
You
the
like
app
that?
strategy.
I was thinking, you're going to be president of 5G.
president or something. President
No,
versus
that's a good
VP is where I'm focused.
Obviously, I hope you have massive pay rises in the intervening period.
But we'll go with the other part. Yeah. So ideally, again, we get out of this 3-stroke engine problem with the industry where, you got 5G and everybody's excited and the investment's going up and the innovation is flowing, and then people deploy and then you kind of fall off the other edge and you can get to something that's a little more consistent development of value. So I'm hoping that I am the EVP of the programmable network in 3 years. And I want to see us, I want to see all of those green shoots I talked about for profitability. Do I think I'm smart enough for all of them to hit? No. Am I hoping that we get at least a couple of them to hit at scale? I absolutely believe we can. I see a huge, as I said, there's a bunch of ideas that have floated around for a while that tends to generate skepticism because they don't show up and they don't show up and they don't show up, and then boom, the right conditions happen and they do take off. There is real value in the scenarios people are talking about for the use of AI to catch fraud and to make consumer experiences better and to be voice assistants. There's real value in expanding out the use of data and analytics and automation to make industrial scenarios and transport scenarios more valuable. There are a lot of real world value there. The question is are we at the stage where the technology is easy enough to implement? Maybe not yet. It's going to get there. It has value. I'm hoping that we can make that true faster.
Okay, I presume you're not going to want to say anything, Ian, because you're in a hurry. So I'm going to wrap up by going, I'm going to interpret your answer, Sean. I'm going to interpret your answer as you going, yeah, maybe we shouldn't bang on so much about 6G, but all the other things that you just spoke about, which, and if I've interpreted it correctly, then I agree. So yeah, I'll wrap it up there then. That was brilliant. Thanks a lot for coming over.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you here. And you're welcome back anytime. Perhaps when people start going on about 6G, we can revisit. No, hopefully before then. And I will just say, I'll just say to our audience, coming up, we've got some Easter break stuff. So in early April, we might either do them remotely or miss one or two. And the next one might be a little bit early. And actually, the next one, we might talk about 6G quite a lot. So we'll see where that goes. So thanks for listening and make sure you join us for that one.